Strap yourselves in. Strap yourselves in. Strap yourselves in. I don't think I'll need my whiteboard today. Turn the echo off. There we go. All right, thank you. It's time to get back into the mix. We had a lot of fussy Thomas this week. Once again, fussy Thomas. And one guy said, why won't you debate the guy that we set you up to debate with? Well, the kid that you set me up to debate with ended up getting a reading list from me and had not made his mind up yet whether he was or was not a sedevacantist. So, no, I'm not going to debate that kid. I mean, I've put 10 years just into the question of essence-energy distinction, along with all the other topics. 14, 15 years now of patristics, 19 years of biblical studies. So, no, we can't, it's not going to be fruitful. It's just going to end up being me doing another lecture and telling the Roman Catholics what their doctrine of divine simplicity is, the Thomists. So I might as well just do the streams. There's no point in doing the debates because I know the position better than they do. So today, though, we're not going to be talking about divine simplicity unless somebody brings that up in the chat or something. We're going to be talking about the magistrate. I got a whole bunch of books all laid out here. Because as you can imagine, when all the other theology is all messed up and the worldview is all messed up, you're not going to get your doctrine of the magistrate right. You're not going to get your doctrine of the state right. And kind of, it's kind of a no-brainer because all the theology flows from the starting point. It all flows from the doctrine of God, God's relationship to the world, the incarnation, Christology, sacramentology, ecclesiology, eschatology, anthropology. They all flow from being part of the same coherent system. So that's why you can't do, say, anthropology apart from your Christology, right? The council's already codified and set out what the proper, correct anthropology is based on the relationship of the divine person of the Logos taking on impersonal human nature. So once that's understood, we start to see why we can't theologize apart from revelation and apart from the interpretation of that revelation at the councils, guided, of course, as St. Athanasius says, by the Holy Spirit. Speaking of the councils, in other words, Pentecost, this is completely lost or more or less lost in a historic sense in Protestantism. Protestantism is correct to understand the guidance of the Holy Spirit for the individual, but they forget the collective guidance of the Holy Spirit for the singular historic body of the church and her councils. So Pentecost came, and Pentecost guided the church. This is also why we can't do our doctrine of the magistrate, the civil magistrate, the doctrine of the statecraft, as if that functioned independently from revelation. That whole idea is an invention of the Enlightenment, of the philosophes, Voltaire, Diderot, Robespierre, all those clowns. They're the ones that started promoting the idea that we can have a secular, independent state. The Protestant Reformation churches, ironically, began as state churches. So the German princes, they helped foster the original Lutheran movement, the Lutheran church. Calvin set up a theocracy, right, where he burned Servetus. Everybody knows this, who knows church history. We have other examples of Protestant attempts at theocracies, right? Henry VIII, the Anglican Church, at one time was a theocracy, but before it turned into a transocracy now. But it should have been obvious that any church that put the queen as the head of the church is ridiculous. There's no woman who's the head of the church. I'm sorry. But now Christ is the head of the church, of course. And so what is the doctrine of the magistrate? Is there such a thing as a correct doctrine of the magistrate. A lot of people don't think there is, especially the champions of revolution in America, in Orthodoxy, the Ameridox, and their compatriots in this nonsense, the evangelicals and the Roman Catholics, who, again, for the most part, except for the trad cats, we can agree with the traditional Catholics on this point, there is a revealed doctrine, a correct doctrine of the magistrate. It is not a situation where it's all left up to flux and we don't know, and there's no system that God prefers. There's no system that's true. It's all just random. It's all just chaotic, and we have a private realm of devotion, but the realm of the public sphere, that's all just secular. That's what everybody can, through social contract or through Republican or Democratic process, decide whatever they want. Now, obviously, this is ridiculous, because if God exists and he's the God that we present and know about from Scripture, he's sovereign, he's omnipotent, he's omnipresent. So there's no area of life that's not subject to the kingdom of God. It's precisely this reason why the West loses so much ground to Islam, is because Western theology is preposterous. It has almost completely adopted the doctrine that there should not be any confessional states. There should not be any place for God in the public sphere. Now, it's a no-brainer to see why you're going to lose to positions that don't banish God from the public sphere, right? So I'm not saying Islam's true, but I'm saying you're never going to beat Islam when you have classical liberalism as your foundation. Islam is going to destroy you, and they will destroy you, and they are destroying the West. Theologically, philosophically speaking, demographically speaking, because of the ridiculous, stupid heresies of Western thought. That goes for the philosophers all the way over to the theologians, the whole crew, the whole kit and caboodle. And again, in this regard alone, there aren't many allies for traditional classical Orthodox position, except for the Roman Catholics. Ironically, traditional Catholics have the same view that we do on the history of confessional states and the magistrate. And that's because everybody who knows anything about the first 1,000 years of the church knows there were confessional states. This is not even, it's amazing that anyone even tries to debate it. But when you grow up in America, when you grow up in the freedom obsessed West, freedom, D-U-M-B, more freedoms, you have the idea from the outset that, right, that freedom is just sort of this amorphous thing that operates on its own. Like it doesn't come within a context or worldview. Like freedom is just this self-evident maxim out there. What does it mean? How can you have a doctrine of or philosophy of freedom without a philosophy of the will? Is the will connected to what it is to be a human person or to human nature? I mean, how can any of this make any sense without a philosophy? That's why we start to say, oh, wait a minute. It really has nothing to do with philosophy. It's just a social engineering slogan that revolutionaries have used since the time of the French Revolution. Well, of course. Every ruler, every tyrant, every dictator that's ever existed claimed to be the freedom candidate, the man of the people, the proponent of freedom. The word has absolutely no significance outside of a context, outside of a worldview. So the way that we're going to understand freedom, the way that we're going to understand will, volition, entities operating with freedom or without freedom, is only going to be sensible within the context of our total worldview. Our total worldview is going to, as we know, encompass the basics of philosophy, ethics, morals, our doctrine of how we know things, how we know about the world, how we interpret the world, and metaphysics, what's real and what's not real. Everybody has a worldview. Our worldview is not based upon speculations merely about the natural world. It's not based merely upon looking out at the natural world and then we see predators and prey and we see patterns in nature. Therefore, we can come up with natural law. Natural law is essentially another meaningless term, almost, depending upon what one views nature as. If I view nature as a chaotic, meaningless process from a Big Bang or whatever, nature has a completely different meaning than a person who believes that it's created. If you believe in creation, if you believe in the doctrine of Scripture, if you believe in creation ex nihilo, then nature has a completely different meaning for you, right? It's only made sensible and interpreted with the presupposition of God. For the non-believing person, nature is a chaotic, meaningless process that they import meaning to, or they think there might happen to just be patterns out there in nature, right? And so we sort of vaguely base our universalized perceptions on these patterns, if you're in the sort of naturalistic, natural law tradition. Now, it gets confusing because we, as Orthodox or in the history of the Christian church, natural law is used in different senses. Right? So sometimes natural law means the principles operant in nature. Okay, and that could be interpreted in a Thomistic sense, in an Orthodox sense, a St. Maximus sense. And you'll notice that St. Maximus doesn't teach a strict nature-grace distinction. In fact, for St. Maximus, nature is grace. Nature is a gracious gift to us, and there's nothing more natural to man than grace, St. Maximus says. This is one of the reasons why we set him over against the Thomistic view of the nature-grace stacked-on kind of tier system of Thomism. Anyway, you might say, well, what does that have to do with the state? Well, it has everything to do with the state, because how we view man, whether we believe in a fall or not, is going to determine whether we think there should be a state, whether it was ordained by God, what its role is, what its extent and limitations are, and how the state comes to be, or how we select a magistrate. Now, you know that at Jay's Analysis, we defend Genesis. We've been defending Genesis for something like 10 years now. We have no qualms about that. If you want to hear the talks on evolution and skepticism and questioning of evolutionary theory, there's plenty of those. The talk I just did the other night for subscribers to Jay's Analysis, the second part of the Jordan Peterson origin talk, you can go listen to that, where we discussed Cornelius Hunter's book, Darwin's God. Now, here, though, we're not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking specifically about the state. We're going to be already assuming the authenticity of Genesis, right? So we can't reinvent the wheel for every talk we do. So here we come to, well, the first of all, the question of Adam. Adam is created in a situation where there exists divine law. Okay, so when we understand the morals of the Ten Commandments, the fact that the moral law is a reflection of God's own holiness, was made in accordance with his holy nature, then we understand that when Adam and Eve sinned, they essentially broke the entire moral law. Right? That's why the covenant, throughout all the succession of centuries, throughout the patriarchs, the prophets, up to Christ, it's only one covenant. It's that one covenant that's built upon, right? Each successive covenant builds upon the previous, and it expands. Right, we've talked about this in many of the biblical talks on the expansion of the covenant from family to tribe to nation to the world. That was God's Heilsgeschichte, history of redemption. Now, when we come to the question of the magistrate, it's similar to, curiously, the question of veganism, because it's not until the time of Noah that God specifically says you can eat meat. This is why I didn't really have that much of a problem with the Darren Aronofsky Noah movie. People are saying, oh, it's vegan propaganda. Maybe. I don't know what his view, if he has like an intense vegan propaganda position, then I'm sure that is true. But just simply looking at the text of Genesis, it's not until Noah that the allowance of eating meat is given. Most people aren't aware of that. The movie actually got that right. But what everybody doesn't pay attention to in regard to Noah also is not only is the dominion mandate reaffirmed, go forth, multiply, have dominion, right? This is also where God institutes the death penalty. Let's read. So this is Genesis 9. So God blesses Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. The fear and the dread of you will be on all the beasts of the earth, and every bird of the air, and on all the things that move on the earth, and all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. But you shall not eat the flesh with the lifeblood that is in it. In other words, cook your meat. Surely your lifeblood I will demand. For your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require a reckoning. This is why in Mosaic law, if an ox gores a man, the ox has to be put to death. For the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. That's the death penalty. Okay, so if you kill a man, lex talionis, right, eye for an eye, the justice of God's law metes out that you should be put to death. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Why? Why? Is it just because of secular humanism? Is it because man is so awesome? Well, it's because man is made in the image of God, and the murdering of another man is a defacing of the image of God in man. That's what God says. Whoever shall shed man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. As for you, be fruitful and multiply. Go forth abundantly in the earth and multiply. For my covenant is with you and your seed after you. Right? I will establish my covenant with you. And never again will all flesh be cut off the world as a result of a flood. And never again shall there be a flood to destroy the entire earth. So, the sign of the covenant is set in the heavens, the rainbow. That is the sign of the Noahic covenant. And again, we all know that in Acts 15, when the Jerusalem Council makes the decision about how Gentiles are to be received into the almost completely Jewish church at that time, they actually look back to the covenant with Noah. They look back to the Noahic principles, and they said, if Noah was made righteous this way, then it was prior to circumcision. Then circumcision itself is not what makes a man righteous. Therefore, we can receive the Gentiles into the church merely by baptism. This is part of the point of baptism, replacing the type of circumcision. So that's how God is being consistent with the principles of the Noahic covenant. Same salvation in the New Testament with Christ, no different. Baptism puts you into the kingdom. So, most people forget, though, that this is the institution of the state. This is the beginning of the legality, from the divine perspective, of the institution of the death penalty as a legitimate eye for eye, lex talionis principle for how to deal with those who are manslayers, who are murderers. And you say, well, no, wait a minute. That's the Old Testament. Jesus came to do away with all of that Old Testament. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. Go back and listen to the Bible contradiction, Old Testament versus New Testament talk. We covered all that. What we are arguing against is 300 years, 400 years of people with false presuppositions as a result of the Enlightenment, Reformation, Scientific Revolution, French Revolution, American Revolution. Those Masonic democratic principles have infected the entire world. And so everybody is bathed in this situation when they're born to think that God has nothing to do with that stuff. Right? God is your personal, private, pietistic thing. The heresy of pietism, essentially. Not the public sphere. Of course, this is completely not true. It's not only not true in the New Testament and the early church, the book of Acts, it's also not true for the entire history of the church. The first 1,000 years of the church, this is completely not true. And anybody who knows the history of the church for the first 1,000 years knows this. How many ecumenical, all of them, all 8 of them, under the guidance of Orthodox emperors. And we're going to see, what do the councils say about these emperors? Well, they say that they're the God-ordained emperors. They say that they rule under God, and may God grant them victory against all of their enemies. That's a little different, isn't it, from the modern idea that God has nothing to do with the civil sphere. And not only that, we're going to see that it's not just a question of like moral majority crap, this kind of bullshit, from Falwell and all that nonsense. That was all organized by the Pentagon just to get people to mindlessly support the Pentagon's foreign interventionism and all this stuff. No. We're not talking about any of that crap. We are talking about a completely different perspective of the state, of the relationship between church and state, of what a state is, of nation states functioning within harmony within the overall imperium. There is no question that this is the traditional view of the church, East and West. Even after the split, this is still true. But I want to read just real quick a couple of the super chats before we continue with the questions of the doctrine of the magistrate. Brandon Fort, $20, my favorite series by far. Thank you, Brandon. We always appreciate your support. Longtime supporter of Jay's analysis and super chatter. Much appreciated there. I'm glad you like the series. I thought I needed to introduce a little more organization into how we approach these questions. There's just so many topics and videos that we do that it's so all over which isn't bad. It's not bad to be all over the place, but I don't know. Again, I still can't figure out how to organize all this stuff. A123B456 £5, I think. Is freedom of speech as a supposed moral principle ultimately predicated on relativism? What is the Orthodox position on censorship? Yeah, that's a good question. It's a pretty involved question because, again, everybody believes in some limitations on freedom of speech. So really the debate is over the restrictions and constrictions and extent of the freedom. So yes, if we lived in a situation, and again, you can go back to the Code of Justinian, obvious example of the implementation of Orthodox ethos and principles into the civil sphere. I don't know how anybody doesn't know about this, how people have forgotten the Code of Justinian. It's like one of the key bases of the entire history of Western global legal theory, as well as Byzantium, its legal theory. There would be restrictions on speech, right? So you can't blaspheme. You can't put out blasphemous, anti-Trinitarian garbage, right? That is, again, another question of if we had a majority Orthodox population, and this doesn't have to be done out of accord with people's free consent either, because the only way we would ever have another Christian confessional state would be when the majority of the population is converted, right? So this is pretty normative in anywhere in church history. Nobody thinks that you are supposed to go out and conquer the people and force them to convert. That would be ridiculous. So you would have a nation of fake converts. It would be a disaster. So we only have a confessional state when a majority of the population has converted. This is what happens in the history of the Imperium. It takes 3 centuries before the Imperium converts. And then it takes another century or two, right? So it's actually not Constantine, it's actually Theodosius, where we start to see the implementation of the moral, biblical, Christian principles put into the Imperium. I want to add another little note too here. This is another reason why the councils are so much more important, is because councils, more so than any single church father, this is what you get from the Protestants and even Roman Catholics at the time, is they'll start going to, and even the Orthodox don't believe in an Orthodox magistrate, they'll start going to the church fathers and they'll pick out like, oh, look at what Tertullian said in this one spot here. How can you believe that well, first of all, Tertullian is not a saint, but secondly, the councils are better for this kind of a peering into the mind of the church, because it's the entire church. It's the entire ecumene, the entire imperium, right? So it's the mind of the church in that century set over against the errors. So we get a consensus type of view, right, which is important. It's not only based on consensus, but that is one of the factors that goes into the early church and the councils determining doctrines. We get a mindset in a much broader sense than picking out this or that church father, right? So I'm not saying that you can't ever proof text, but it's just like proof texting from Scripture, right? I mean, Jesus proof text, Paul proof text, right? But proof text is only as good as the context, okay? So problem isn't proof texting. The problem is whether the proof texting is from the correct context. So it doesn't matter, like the horrible kind of tracts that you see at Catholic Answers where it's like this and this and this and this quote from these church fathers without any context, right? Like Irenaeus' quote about the importance of Rome. It's cut off, and doesn't show the context, where he doesn't say that it's because of some magical primacy that Rome itself has because of Peter. He says it's because of Peter and Paul. That's why it's doubly apostolic. All right. And that is different from the argument that Peter alone and his successors has an infallible ex cathedra, indefectibility charism, because the Antiochian church has its succession from Peter. The bishops of Antioch were set up by Peter. Anyway, so point being is that we can look at the councils in all of these centuries, all the way up to the 8th/9th council, or the 8th. Well, for us, it's the 8th council. It's different than the Roman. That's where it splits. Actually, the Roman Catholics have a different 8th council than we do. But all the way up through, you have it's not rocket science to figure out the doctrine of the magistrate. It doesn't require a PhD to figure out whether rulers are required to rule according to God's moral law. This is not again, not rocket science. It's not that hard to figure out if you know your Bible, right? I mean, I came to this stuff over time from reading the Bible. And yes, I branched out into church fathers, and yes, I had interest in philosophy and all these other questions. And I know about Hugo Grotius, and I know about his analysis of the history of the magistrate and Western thought. And I've read Monson and Rushton and all those guys. I know all this stuff. All right. So, but what I'm getting at is that if a person knew what Scripture said, and you don't have to go that far in the church fathers either. Even the 1st century, 2nd century church fathers that are always trotted out by the people who say, we need to go back to an early church perspective without this doctrine of the state. This is very popular. The people who hate the neo-patristic synthesis, the people who hate traditional Orthodox ideas, the Ameridox, basically. This is their view. They think that the problem was that the church had some connection to the state. That's the problem. And if we were to retreat to this pre-conversion, this is like Seventh-day Adventist kind of argument, Baptist arguments, ridiculous arguments brought into. Why is this? Well, because of a fundamental assumption that there's some problem with the doctrine of divine providence and sovereignty. Now, as we're going to see, we move through. If we think about Genesis, how does Joseph view Pharaoh? This is an interesting question. Now you say, wait a minute. The book of Exodus, Pharaoh is a tyrant. He's a monster. He is. However, was Pharaoh providentially put into that role, even as a monster? Yes. Scripture is abundantly clear that all magistrates have their position as a result of divine providence. Even Pilate, right, responsible for handing Christ over to be murdered. What does Jesus say to Pilate? You would have no authority unless it were given to you by heaven. Do we remember the book of Daniel? What does it say about Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar gets arrogant and he brags against God. And God drives Nebuchadnezzar mad into the wilderness for 7 years. And Nebuchadnezzar comes to his senses and he says, you know what? I'm humbled because I realize that I have my position from God, from divine providence and sovereignty. Cyrus in Isaiah. God providentially allows the temple to be rebuilt by Cyrus. Cyrus is called a shepherd, right? So you say, no, wait a minute, though. How can an evil man be in a position of authority? Well, that's precisely the point here, isn't it? All throughout the Old Testament, whether it's the period of the judges or whether it's the period of the kings, even the wicked, even the evil ones, right? How does David view Saul? Does David view Saul as who is a wicked king? Eventually, right? He falls, apostatizes. Does David say, oh, it's time to start the anti-Saul revolution? It's time to do Occupy Jerusalem and let's overthrow Saul. No, of course not. In fact, he trembles before attempting to murder God's anointed, because Samuel had anointed Saul to that role, and David had the correct view via humility to say, touch not mine anointed. Right? This is what God says in Deuteronomy. Do not touch my anointed ones. Do not touch my prophets. And by extension, the king is the magistrate. You don't have the right to just up and behead the king. So I'm working my way through, right? We're going to get to all the objections. We're going to get to that stuff. So we've got to work through here. So I wanted to point out too, though, if we look in the Apocalypse, the saints under the altar, they pray for God's justice and vengeance to be meted out on those who persecute the saints on earth, because it is just and meet and right. In other words, eye for eye. What is one of the top dumb objections that ignorant people make about the Bible is that Jesus came to do away with eye for eye. No, he didn't. Jesus inspired the book of Revelation. He inspired the saints speaking in heaven that God should exact his justice on the basis of eye for an eye. That's what they say, right? Since they killed the saints, God ought to kill them. That's called eye for an eye. That's justice. It's no different than the justice that God said to Noah. It is just. It is eye for eye. Again, if you listen to the New Testament, Old Testament talk, Jesus is not doing away with the idea of justice. He's not doing away with the idea of justice in the civil sphere. Do you think Jesus came that his teachings mean that you can't be a judge? No, this is retarded. Nicaea says you don't have to stop being a member of the army. It's one of the canons of Nicaea, right? Because there was a dispute amongst some of the early church. They said you can't be in the army and serve Christ. You have to forsake all of this civil sphere stuff. And this is the heresy of the Anabaptists, the heresy of the Baptists. This is their whole origin, is this stupid error. And it's because they don't understand the relationship between the Old and the New Testament. You see how it all hinges on that? You see? And so when we have Marcionite Gnostic doctrines, well, guess what? It just screws up our whole doctrine of the state and the civil order. That's why I just made that video on the Cathars. If you read Malcolm Lambert's 600-page book on the history of the Cathars and medieval heresy, which I did when I was like 21, 22, I took like 50 pages of notes from that book because I wanted to know all about the heretics of the Middle Ages. Why do you think the Cathars were persecuted? Just because kings were mean? No, because the doctrine that they had uprooted the entire civil order. They wanted to institute a republic. They wanted to institute usury. They wanted to institute a bunch of craziness. And they weren't going to stop. So that's why the death penalty was necessary. Anyway, we're going to we're going to work through all of these points historically. Now, this is an important principle too that we have to keep in mind here. Right. So first problem as we're working up through here. I'm amazed that everybody makes this basic bitch objection because it's preposterous. It's one of the weakest, dumbest arguments I've ever heard. And it's the argument that everybody makes. What about Samuel? What do we do about Samuel? Well, this is really a no-brainer, right? So we're going to move up through. Now, Joshua, by the way, I have to make the additional point here. Joshua is basically a king. If you look at the way Joshua leads the people in the conquest of Palestine, Canaan's land, he functions like a king. He's not called a king, but he functions that way. Now, after this, we get the period of the Judges, right? Everybody knows about the book of Judges. Great, great book. A lot of fun to read the book of Judges. A lot of types of Christ, right? Angel of the Lord, that's Jesus appearing many times. The Judges are a failure. Everybody says, oh, but the period of the kingship was a failure. Oh, the period of the Judges also was a failure, right? So every Republican and every so-called Democrat, before they get to this stuff about Samuel, they'll make this dumb argument that, well, God raised up judges. Yeah, and how'd that work out? Well, let's see. The book of Judges is actually a treatise against judges. The book begins talking about all these problems. And how does it end? It says, there was no king in Israel in that time, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. The book of Judges is a treatise on relativism. It is not a defense against monarchy. Now, before the situation with Samuel had occurred, Mosaic law stipulated the rules and laws for kings. Therefore, kings is not inherently evil. Monarchy is not inherently evil. The law already stipulated what to do when Israel selects a king. And we're going to see, but we've got to pay attention to, because there is a rebuke for asking for a king. But is it because of the form of government? No. The rebuke is on the basis of the bad morals and reasons for which they want a king. It's not because of the problem of monarchy itself. So if we read Deuteronomy 17, the principles governing kings, when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you and you possess it and you dwell in it and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations around me. You will surely set a king over you. Now, if God was opposed to monarchy, he would have said, do not put a king over you. But you will choose the one whom the Lord your God chooses from among your brethren, and you will set him as king over you, that you may not be seen to be. You may not set a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. You shall not multiply. He shall not multiply his horses. You shall not have, excessive taxes, etc., etc. So there's these stipulations binding the king, right? So the king is bound by law. Supposed to be. So therefore, obviously, the institution of Mosaic law was not opposed to kingship. We should also point out, too, that Genesis 49 had already predicted the royal lineage. The prediction of the coming of Christ in Genesis 49 from the tribe of Judah, the scepter, the royal scepter, that means royal rulership, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and unto him shall be the obedience of the nations. So the monarchy will continue in Israelite history until the Messiah comes. It's not a treatise against monarchy either. It's just saying that the Israelite monarchy, when it comes to an end, is when you know the time of the Messiah is come. And when the Messiah is come, who is called Shiloh here. Shiloh means peace. When the lineage of Judah, the Davidic king, arrives, is when the royal scepter departs from Judah. When did the royal scepter depart from Judah? In the first century, when Herod ruled. And when Christ came, the rulership of the Jewish nation ends. You have the destruction of the temple, 70 AD, the dispersion of the peoples. That's the fulfillment of this prophecy. It's not talking about the end of the world. It's not talking about some evangelical nonsense. It's talking about the first advent of Christ. But we see that not only does it predict when the royal scepter ends for Judah, not for the whole world. It predicts when the royal scepter ends at the time of the coming of the Messiah for the tribe of Judah. But notice that it already predicts a monarchy. Okay, so just like Deuteronomy predicts the monarchy, so does Genesis 49. Now, when we come to the question of Samuel, Samuel rebukes the people, just like Deuteronomy did, for wanting a king like the nations around them. That's the key there. The problem is not the form of government. The problem is that the hard-hearted Crowleyite Israelites who wanted to worship all kinds of nastiness, as we see throughout the book of Kings, right? They wanted to have their male prostitutes and all this, and their bestiality and their human sacrifice cult. They wanted all that back. Those hard-hearted Israelites wanted a king like the nations around them, like the nations around them, like the nations around them. What did the kings of the nations around them do? Well, they were tyrants, and they promoted this sex cult. Right? We know this from listen to my talks on the books of the kings. Jeroboam with his Bethel and Dan sex cult that he set up, the golden calf brought back. They wanted a king who was viewed as divine. What does Caesar say when Caesar comes? Caesar says, I am God, I am the Son of God, I am divine. Caesar claims to be divine. Pharaoh claimed to be divine, right? All of these pagan emperors set themselves up as claiming to be divine. Now, we might think dialectically and think that, oh, well, since that's true, then God is opposed to all rulers, all kings, all emperors, all authority. So God, in this dialectical gobbledygook view, becomes the great revolutionary. All right, what does Mark Pazio say about Jesus? Jesus is the revolutionary. Jesus is the anarchist. No, he's not. You have no idea what you're talking about. Jesus is the King of Kings, the monarch of monarchs. So all the monarchs of the world rule under him. Now, again, what happens in Daniel? Does Daniel say, Nebuchadnezzar, you're a pagan, and therefore you have no authority. You don't rule. No, he says that your rulership is given to you by God. Whether you use it or misuse it, you will be judged for that. See? This same position and principle, the way Joseph views Pharaoh, the way Daniel views Nebuchadnezzar, the way they view Cyrus, when Cyrus does good, all the way up through to Jesus talking to Pilate, you would have no authority except that were given to you from heaven. All the way up through to Paul in Romans 13. Okay. Now, who is emperor during the period of Paul writing Romans 13? Well, probably Nero, right? And one of those guys around the time of Nero who persecuted the church. Now, does Paul say God has told us that Jesus, our great Savior, wants us to have nothing to do with the state, and Jesus is our great anarchist leader, and we are here as a subversive force against Caesar? No. Everything that Paul's going to say is completely consistent with perspective of the magistrate all the way back to Genesis. There's no conflicting different positions, and no. It's a consistent position about how to view the magistrate as a servant of God. Yes, you heard me right. The magistrate is a minister of God, a diakonos. A diakonos. He's not literally a deacon in the church, but he's a diakonos. However, in Byzantium, the emperor alone was allowed behind the altar. And so there was a special place even given to the emperor as a diakonos of God, because he is also an icon of Christ in terms of Christ's justice. Right? What does Paul say? Now, all the evangelicals go nuts over this, and they go crazy trying to figure out what it means. It's not that difficult. Again, it's consistent with everything that we've seen so far, all the way back to Genesis. Again, note this. Paul is completely consistent with what's told to Noah. Paul sees no discontinuity between his doctrine of the civil magistrate and the state and the doctrine expounded to Noah of the legitimacy of the state to exact the death penalty. Romans 13 says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which is given from God. The authorities that do exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God. Those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Then do what is right, and you will have praise. For he is God's diakonos, minister, deacon, to you for good. But if you do evil, you ought to be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is God's diakonos, minister, to execute wrath, death, on those who practice evil. What does a sword do? A sword doesn't put you into a private prison so that you can become a wage slave for private corporations. A sword cuts your head off. Therefore, you must be subject not only because of wrath, but for conscience sake. For because of this, you must also pay your taxes. For they are God's diakonos, God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Therefore, render to all their due. Taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs are due, and fear to whom fear is due, and honor to whom honor is due. Now, wait a minute. That sounds like Erastianism. If you're not familiar with this term, this is the continual objection of certain evangelicals, Calvinists, Protestants, and even at times some Roman Catholics, that this sounds like you're making the state God on earth. No. Who is Paul writing about at this time? A pagan persecuting emperor. He is talking about probably Nero. Nero was a demonic monster. But Paul did not say, let's start a political revolution. Let's start a revolutionary force and overthrow the state. No, he said even these demonic monsters are put there because the Roman Imperium is an imperium of order. Okay, it was ordained in God's providence to be there. Right, even Maccabees. Right, read the books of the Maccabees. It shows how the Roman Empire came to be after the period of the Greeks, after Alexander. And it's explained in God's providence. Okay. Now, does that mean that because of this role, that we have therefore no duty to ever disagree or ever disobey, that we have to do anything it says? If Caesar comes and says, burn your children on the altar and let me eat them, and you eat them in front of me, in front of my face? No, obviously not. Of course not. How do we know that? Well, Paul lost his head to one of these Roman emperors, right? Probably Nero. So the point being is that they weren't dumb. They're operating the same way that Daniel operated. Did Daniel say, well, since you're the appointed emperor and in God's providence you have that role, I will therefore do anything that you say? No. Daniel is almost put to death multiple times. Daniel in the lion's den. Yeah. We will not bow to your giant golden idolater image. Then you will go into the furnace. Okay? So there's a clear delineation between the sphere of authority. Okay? This is what's called spheres, basically. Spheres of authority. And this is very important for understanding different structures in society. So the role of the family, that's a certain sphere, right? The head of the household, the father, he has a certain authority within a certain sphere. The people who are teachers in your university, they have a certain authority within a certain sphere. The magistrate has a certain authority within a certain sphere. And the minister, the priest, right? The church has a sphere of authority. The church can't tell you, you have to give me your children for disgusting sex practices, right? That you cannot have that authority. You can't do that. If they do that, they have to be obeyed. Why? Because we want to be rebellious? No, because we are obeying a higher authority. The higher authority being God himself. If the magistrate says, you must believe Arian doctrines, do we follow him just because he's the magistrate? No. He is to be repelled and to be opposed. Does that mean that we have to oppose him with trying to overthrow the government? No. I mean, there's case-by-case bases. If you had a significant amount of, say, lesser nobles who were knowing that this guy was wrong, and the coup or whatever could result in the restoration of an Orthodox monarch or something like that, maybe. And you see this in the history of Byzantium, where there's different possibilities or situations where a coup might actually be beneficial. It might be better in the long run to have an Orthodox emperor, so forth. And you see this too in the history of the church, where iconoclast emperors or heretic emperors try to enforce some heresy and they fail. And if God weren't with the church, right? If we were truly Erastian, that is, if the state ruled the church, if that was really true, then we would have believed all of these heresies long ago, because the Arian emperors or the semi-Arian emperor or the pagan emperor Julian or the iconoclast emperors, they would have enforced their doctrines and the whole church would have accepted it. And so the mere fact that we continue on with the Orthodox faith, which is the same as what the saints believed in the first century, shows that we're not Erastian. So our position of Symphonia, of the two-headed eagle, that's not Erastianism. That's not the state runs the church. Have emperors at times screwed this up? Has there been corruption in the church? Yes. And guess what? That's been in every church. That's been in the East, in the West, in the investiture controversy. The entire country of England for centuries had a problem called the investiture controversy, where the king put his buddy as the bishop. Simony, wage slaves, investiture controversy. This has always been there, and it's always going to be there. It's a problem that's in the Old Testament, where the priests are basically installed by Jeroboam or whoever, and they're phonies. And they're part of the sex cult of Jeroboam or whatever. It's no different in the Latin West, right? With the papacy becoming a tool of Charlemagne and the Franks. And that's exactly what happened, despite the Roman Catholics who don't want to believe that. I used to not want to believe that. But that's exactly what happened. If you read what Photius says about the Frankish missionaries, it becomes obvious why that's true. And you should also watch the new documentary on Byzantium, which I will be posting on the site, put out by Russia Insight, I think, or one of those sites. But it's translated from, it's a Russian documentary on Byzantium, finally translated. It's really good. It's like 3 hours long. It's called Christian Empire Wrecked by the West, I think. Anyway. So I think our doctrine, by the way, Paul in the New Testament, they never say Peter is the galactic emperor who has authority over Caesar either, or the temporal realm. They don't say that one guy in the church can excommunicate and has galactic power over the magistrate like Unum Sanctum does, right? If you read the medieval decree Unum Sanctum, it basically says the papacy has galactic universal God emperor powers, basically. It's like Emperor Shaddam IV or something from Dune. I'm going to read a few more super chats before we continue with this, because we're getting some good ones here. Thank you guys for the super chats. Much appreciated. Nick Jones, thanks, Jay, for all your hard work. Very helpful. Thank you, Nick Jones. I appreciate the $20. That's what keeps me going. Much appreciated. God bless you. Randy Churchill, $20. What is the difference between theonomy and the Orthodox view of the Old Testament law? This is a good question. The basic principles of theonomy, if you just mean that aspects of the Old Testament moral law still apply, that is the Orthodox view. When the Code of Justinian is attempting to implement Orthodox morals and principles into the civil sphere, and the emperors after him that continued to do that, That's just being consistent with the theology, being consistent with the fact that that God's kingdom is the church, but it's not just the church. Again, we don't fall into dialectics here and say that, well, because the church is spiritual, it's against the world. The world is physical, and that's under the devil, and the church is this pietistic little thing hovering in the corner. No. That's what all these goofuses and Rod Dreyers and all these people tell you. Flee from the world. And there is a time for monasticism. There is a place for that stuff. But the entire history of the church is not about you having some pietistic removal from the world. The problem is not the world. The problem is not physicality. The problem is not nation states. The problem is not the state. The problem is not any external thing. Man's problem is inside. It's his heart. So you don't flee from all these things in this Gnostic view, like, if I get rid of all of my secular music CDs and I throw them in the trash. That's what evangelicals do, right? Then now there might be a time in your life when you have an attachment to that stuff. Maybe you do need to purge yourself from addiction to, CDs and music. That's not CDs anymore. You know what I mean? I'm thinking back to like 90s, but I need to take a year off of video games so that I'm not attached to video games. I need to take a year away from drinking. I used to do this in my 20s when I drank a lot. I'd say, you know what, this is interfering with my focus, and I would take a year off of drinking. Or I would take 2 years off, or I'd take 6 months. That's just basic principles of fasting. That's the purpose of fasting, right? But what I'm getting at is that when you do that, and then you're when you are no longer attached to those things in an addiction type fashion, what happens is you then can reorient your perspective, and those things get put in their proper place. So you can then go back, not all the way. I mean, if you have a serious addiction to alcohol, then maybe you need to never go back to it or whatever. But if it's playing video games, or if it's I don't know, if you're into sports, and you gorge on sports all day long, or ESPN, or whatever it is, doesn't matter. The point is that then you can come back to those things, and they can have a place in your life that's not excessive and disordered. I mean, that's the whole point here. Self-control. But what happens is a lot of evangelicals, new converts, they have a Gnostic mindset where they think that the evil is in the thing themselves. There's nothing evil inherently in the world. Everything that God created is naturally inherently good. Evil is all in terms of the misuse of things, right? Sexuality is not evil in itself. The problem is the misuse of it. Anyway, with the question, I got way off. The question about theonomy. So theonomy is correct to rebuke the prevalent error that God is somehow separate from spheres of life. God is king of all those spheres of life, whether people acknowledge it or not, whether magistrates believe it or not. That's what we see, from Pharaoh all the way up through the evil kings in the northern tribes of Israel, all the way up through, Nebuchadnezzar, Caesar, it doesn't matter. And they are held much more accountable, right? We see this principle with David. David, as the representative head of Israel, when he makes some errors, it's some serious. God holds him in a very serious judgment because he is the king. He has a high effect. His actions have much more effect than some guy out in the middle of nowhere living on a farm somewhere. He's judged that much more severely because of his role of authority as the covenantal head of the nation. So anyway, point being just that the basic principles of theonomy are fine, and they're really just reflections of things that the church had already discovered long ago. The functionality of the Byzantine Symphonia, right, was already theonomic, so you could say. Where it starts to get problematic is where you get these weird ideas in Rushdoony or these guys where you're trying to mandate Mosaic laws that applied to the land, like seed laws and jubilee laws, and you're trying to cut and paste that over into the New Testament period, that's ridiculous. Okay, I mean, one basic principle here is that even Jews have always understood about their religion is that those laws applied to the land in Israel. Okay, the laws of seeds and this kind of stuff, they don't apply across the world to all the nations. Now you can find principles there, like you could find principles about, well, maybe there's an aspect to which the forbidding of the seeds and interbreeding the seeds, that might apply to GMOs. Maybe that's a good example of why it's bad to do GMOs, but that would not just be a problem or a violation of Mosaic law. It would just be a violation of basic moral law. So what I'm getting at here is that there are principles of penal sanctions which could be insightful and useful, but they're not intended to be universalized across the board. And so there's no one-size-fits-all problem for everything here. So wisdom is all about the application of laws, not in a spurred, autistic fashion, like there's some kind of like calculus that you could do about this. But if you look at the story of Solomon, when Solomon deals with the hoe and the mama, the baby mama, and one of them's a hoe, one of them's a baby mama, does he say, well, the Mosaic law says that a hoe has to be put to death, so does he just stone the hoe? No. He applies wisdom to the situation, and it has to be a case-by-case basis. Okay, this is what very legalistic, sort of strict, obsessive type people, they don't understand the principle of economia. And if we look at the ecumenical councils, the church's principles of economia, which is applying the laws to the times, there's a lot of wisdom in that, right? And it goes back to that letter from St. Basil, where Basil talks about different means of receiving converts, right? This is why people shouldn't freak out over economy in the Orthodox Church and receiving people in different ways. It's not that big of a deal. Nicaea says it's not that big of a deal. But people love to get legalistic. People love to have a way to one-up another person with some little minutia. Right? This is just part of human pride. And I mean, it's just completely unworkable to think about how would you apply seed laws, that are applicable to, ancient Israel to the whole world. It's crazy. Maybe you could make an argument, though, that it applies to GMOs and how GMOs are bad, though. That's an interesting possibility. But that would really just be a reflection of basic principles from Genesis, though. It doesn't necessarily have to be because it was during the Mosaic dispensation. I was looking for one of the canons talks about economia. I was just looking at it, so I was trying to find it. But what I'm getting at is that the way the church applies the canons in economia or economy, the magistrate has to do the same thing when he applies laws to his sphere of government. So those decisions have to be made by actual men in time and space in different scenarios, right? So the case laws are exemplars. They're not one size fits all. And the example that we see with Solomon shows that. Well, I can't find that. I had it marked. Where'd it go? This text about economia and the application of law. Now, notice the people who talk about, like there was this article on the OCA website about how Jesus came to do away with the death penalty. How ridiculous is, do they ever go into any of this? Do they talk about this? Do they talk about any of this biblical stuff? Do they talk about the fact that Father Seraphim Rose says the imperium is the God-ordained means of government? No, they don't ever talk about any of that. Do they talk about the history of Byzantium? No, they don't talk about that. They don't go into any of this stuff. They don't talk about any of the canon law. They don't talk about a canon law, whether it's East or West. Modern civilization grew out of canon law. If you read Malcolm Lambert's Medieval Heresy book, he will show you that canon law, whether East or West, this is applicable to the Latin West and to the Orthodox East. Canon law was the means by which we started to develop coherent legal systems. Now, yes, the legal system in our day is corrupt, but it's better than if you lived in Ghana or Haiti. Okay. We have a lot of honorable things from Roman legal tradition, Byzantine legal tradition, Inquisition legal tradition. Did you know that? Did you know that a lot of modern law theory comes out of Inquisition? Because it was actually the Inquisition that first began the principles of rights of the accused. And arguably maybe back to the Roman period too. But Roman common law, all this stuff, there's biblical principles behind all this stuff. I want to find this economia quote here because it's really good. Do any of the clowns ever talk about this? No, they don't. All they're going to tell you is Jesus came to be a great revolutionary, to overthrow rulers, all some garbage like this, which is completely out of accord with the entire history of the church. And you start asking them this stuff, you start questioning about it, and they're lost. And they just tell you that, they just go ad hominem on you, basically. Here it is, economia. So the Quinisex Council, the Trullo Synod, which, by the way, is the one that mandates that you should have married priests. And guess what? It was accepted at Nicaea too. And you read Roman Catholic academic treatises on Quinisex Council, the Trullo Synod, and they say, yes, it was accepted by Nicaea too, but the Pope later changed his mind and said that that's not good. And there's, of course, Trullo, Quinisex Council, that's the one that we talked about last time, that says that you can't coherently believe that death is natural. Okay, you can't have the theistic evolutionary perspective that there was death and then produced Adam. Okay, death is not natural, the Synod says, and the Quinisex Council 692, it's accepted at actually technically that's from the ancient African code, the statement on death being natural. And I think Trullo talks about it, but the point is that Nicaea too, which is the ecumenical council, ratifies this. So, economia, let's see. It behooves those who have received, this is from Trullo, Quinisex. It behooves those who have received from God the power to loose and to bind, to consider the quality of the sin and the readiness of the sinner for their conversion, and to apply the medicines that are suitable for the disease, lest, if the injunctions in each of these respects, he should fail to regard the healing of the sick man. For if the disease of sin is not simple, but various and multiform, and it germinates in many mischievous offshoots, from which much evil is diffused, and it proceeds further until it is checked by the powers of physician. Therefore, he who professes the science of spiritual medicine ought first of all to consider the disposition of the person who has sinned. Basically, this is a long canon, and it goes on to cite St. Basil. What it's saying is that you can readmit people to the sacraments in a case-by-case basis, and the priest, the bishop, can make that decision. There doesn't have to be one single rule across the board about, say, adultery. One single rule about, nobody, if you've committed adultery, you can never be brought back to the sacrament. It's saying that they can make a case-by-case decision on the basis of the repentance of the person to be received back to the table. That's just one example of economia, okay? If you go back to Nicaea, the canons of Nicaea, we talked about this in previous talks. There's discussion of how to receive converts from heresies and schismatic sects. And the principle of economia is invoked for different means of receiving them. Not everybody has to be received into the church the same way. Basil says it's not that big of a deal. Let's not go crazy over this. All right. So anyway, that's what my response to theonomy in the Orthodox Jew. So really the Orthodox perspective, more appropriately than theonomy, because that has all the connotations of Bonson and Gary North and Rushdoony. One of the easiest ways to show the absurdity of the theonomic perspective is that none of them believe that there should be a single church. So they actually believe in their theonomic states that you can have all of these heretical sects. No, sorry, but you're going to make all these arguments from the Old Testament. God doesn't tolerate like 1,000 different sects, okay? And again, we're not saying that, that means that we have to crush everybody who's Baptist. No, it means that in a situation where the majority of the populace has one belief, it's only natural that they would enact legal stances on the basis of their beliefs. And everybody does this, by the way. Even the secularists do this. Oh, you thought that secularism was just about everybody having free reign? Separation of church and state? Oh, but now you're starting to see that actually they're going to set up giant Baphomet temples and statues, and they're going to mandate that you accept all their degeneracy because you were so naive as to think that God doesn't have anything to do with the civil sphere. So until all the dumb evangelicals and the dumb Roman Catholics fix this this error, they're going to keep losing and losing and losing and losing and losing. And the only way to correct it is to have the right theology. Anthony Hopkins. Sir Anthony Hopkins. Clarice. $20. Thank you for all your work, especially your video refuting atheism. It helped me a lot in my own debates. Cool beans, dude. Glad I can help. Have you ever considered setting up a Streamlab account? Yeah, I think I looked at it one time. Eventually, I'll probably do that. Tactical Boomerism, $5. Have you done any recent talk on Constantine and the conversion of Rome? No, I haven't. I will get to Byzantium eventually. I promise to. I've been meaning to do it for a year. It's just there's so many things to get to. Just watch that new documentary, though. I'll put it up. Be looking for that. The new... it's probably not brand new. It's probably been out for a while, but it's recently translated. Dalton, $5. Can you talk about quantum mechanics and the weird stuff when it comes to the transcendental argument? If you go back to the old Hoaxbusters talks, the old talks with John and Chris, you can find discussions of that stuff. We talk about that quite a bit, actually. Off the top of my head, we did dozens of podcasts, but dude, there's like almost 1,000, 800, 900 videos. There's 1,000 audios. I can't even keep up with them. But if you search, you just have to search quantum, J Dyer, Hoaxbusters, John and Chris. I don't know. I don't even know how to search for it. Humongous, $5. Regarding future trends, should we move to an Orthodox country or stay here in America? I think it's going to be a lot clearer as time goes by. We'll know in the next 10 to 15, 20 years. The Russian Orthodox Church has already said they will accept people who want to move there that are Orthodox if they start being persecuted. So there's a very real possibility that Orthodox Christianity will be persecuted in the West. But I can't give you that kind of advice because it's a case-by-case scenario, and we don't know how bad. It doesn't look like it's going to get better anytime soon. It's possible. We don't have to have a defeatist negative attitude, but we have to also consider the possibility that, yes, we might have to do that if you're able. Grunge Monkey, £5. Any good recommendations for book or material refuting modern biblical criticism? Also, this series is excellent. If you watch my talk on the New Testament, I talk about that, and I recommend some books like F.F. Bruce's little book on the New Testament documents. Actually, Gary North, of all people, has a good little book on the hoax of higher criticism. It's probably cheap on Amazon. Craig Blomberg's book on the New Testament, historical reliability of the New Testament Gospels, I think it's called. That's a good one. But yeah, this is kind of a canard, actually. When you look into textual scholarship, it's all kind of built on House of Cards, basically. And they don't even believe in the Q theory. It was all built on documentary hypothesis and then the missing gospel Q. It's this placeholder and they don't even believe that anymore. So just like Darwinism, within 20 years, the entire irrefutable evidence and proof of Darwinism and higher criticism within 20 years is overturned, and nobody even believes that anymore. So it's all nonsense. It's all shifting sands. They don't actually have any basis for any of the stuff they talk about. They make up theories like Q, and then they throw it away 20 years later. But dum-dums who aren't hip to how academia works, they go around spouting like they're experts.
Well, the Gospels are based upon Q, which is a unknown, unforeseeable, made-up tradition. Blah blah blah. I went to Oxford,
And we see how well that's done for the English people, and the Church of England hasn't all the scholarship. Yes, it's served them very well. Robert Taylor, $5. Russian Orthodoxy makes me very optimistic, but what's the deal with some of their icons portraying God the Father? Yeah, I mean, there were some local synods that, if you read Ouspensky's Theology of the Icon book, he'll talk about the local synods that forbade the portraying of God the Father. I don't think it should be done. I think you can make a good case for that, but the church is a big place. There's a lot of people in different places. The church is decentralized, and so you can't really keep track of what everybody's doing. So yeah, sometimes people will, do icons, or they'll do things iconographically that they probably shouldn't do. But what can you do? You can't police the entire world. You can only really try to make a better case. But there's synods too that talk about not making, now that Christ has come, the icon should be done a certain way, so we don't make symbols of the dove or the lamb anymore, because that's been fulfilled. So does that mean you're going to go to hell if you make an image of Christ as the lamb? I mean, come on, I don't think so. But I mean, the principles make sense though. The principles that Christ is the icon of the Father. I mean, technically, if you have icons of Christ, you have icons of the Father. But the Ancient of Days icon kind of bugs me because, yes, Jesus is the eternal Son of God, but in the text of Daniel, it's Christ in the ascension receiving the authority, the dominion, the power from the Father in the ascension. That's not the end of time. Okay, all these goofus evangelicals think that Daniel 7 is talking about the end of time. No, it's not. It's talking about when he ascended. It even uses the language of the ascension. It uses the same language of the apocalypse of when Jesus receives dominion, thrones, power, authority when he ascended. Not the end of the world, when he ascended. It's abundantly clear. So I think it's probably not a wise thing to do. But, you've had these trends that happen in for a while. The Summa was taught in Russian Orthodox circles for a long time. You had the Greeks for a time got into Aquinas, and that should be purged. So anyway, that's my answer to that question. I'm going to take a brief drink of water and a TT break. Got to go TT. And then we're going to return to the question of more New Testament texts dealing with this, the role of the magistrate, more of church history of the magistrate, Proverbs. Hello, do any of these people read Proverbs? Proverbs is full of discussions of social order, social theory, applying the law to social theory, social cohesion, nobility, classes, hierarchy, kings, all through Proverbs. Does anybody read Proverbs? I mean, it's like I'm talking to Jefferson and Franklin when I go to talk to people in so-called orthodoxy. It's like I'm talking to Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and the same with the Catholics. It's like Lou Rockwell was going to tell you how the state is the problem of mankind throughout history, and it's like, what tradition are you a part of? Like, how do you blend? You can't blend this tradition of Satanism from Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and these clowns with the Orthodox 2,000-year tradition. I mean, where are these people coming from? What is it in the minds of these loons? Anyway, so I'm going to get a drink of water, and we'll return to that question here, the doctrine of the magistrate. Thank you guys for the super chats. Loving those. That's keeps me going here and makes me know that you guys are enjoying this stuff. The meat doctrines, the carnivore doctrines. Let's move away from the simple stuff and get to the meat. What does Hebrews say? You should have already been teachers by now, and we're having to go through the basic doctrines all over again. And really, the doctrine of the magistrate, it just simply flows from the rest of the Christian tradition, the Christian ethos, the Orthodox ethos. It's all very clear. Why, St. John of Kronstadt, one of the great saints, the champion of monarchy. Let's just forget him. Let's forget what he talked about. And let's pick and choose some goofus like Origen or Tertullian, right, to tell us about, the true relationship between church and state. Anyway, let's see. So Proverbs, arguing with a kid yesterday who was hitting me up. And he said, why do we want one ruler? We want a bunch of rulers. That way we can make sure that people don't have power. Power is not a problem. It is God who grants men power. You would have no power unless it were given to you by heaven. Now you can misuse that power, but this whole ridiculous idea that power in itself is what corrupts, no, it's not. Lord Acton or whoever said that about the papacy. It's true that to have galactic God emperor status, over everybody, you're God's regent on earth, that's a lot of power. That's why we don't give that to men. Christ has that, right? Now, the emperor would have a lot of power. That's true. But the point is that ideally, and just because there are violations of the ideals, we don't toss out everything because of that. Okay, so this is another stupid argument that kings are corrupt. Republics and democracies aren't corrupt. They're run by billionaire oligarchs, trillionaire oligarchs. At least with a king, you have a better chance of him not being just completely bought off. Because, as we know, Christendom forbade usury. Right? That's one of the main means of running the world, is tricking everybody into accepting usury. Usury on an international scale, right? I'm not talking about the credit union, or whatever. Your local credit union. Well, Proverbs 28 says, when the transgressions of a land, because of the transgressions of a land, many are the princes, but a man of understanding and knowledge and right will be prolonged. Wait, by a man of understanding and knowledge, right will be prolonged. So we see that it's not some advantageous situation to have a bunch of competing idiot political parties. Okay? God has instituted a separation of powers, spheres of authority. Okay, but there's not some advantage to a bunch of stupid-ass political parties. The Green Party, the Anarcho Party, the Libertarian Party, the blah, blah, the Democratic Party. That's all just control mechanisms for the goofuses who buy into the system. Proverbs 29:2 says, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when a wicked man rules, the people groan. The king establishes the land by justice, but he who receives bribes perverts it. Oh, wait a minute. I thought that we weren't supposed to have authority. We're supposed to forsake that and flee from, no. That's what cowards do. That's called being a wuss. And when you don't do it, the wicked man will certainly step in and do it. Right? Oh, you thought we were going to have a secular government where everybody's free, and then suddenly it's a bunch of satanic Luciferians who want to eat you and eat your children. No, the king establishes the land by justice, Solomon says. Where there is no divine revelation, people cast off their restraints, but happy are those who keep the law. That means that the social order is affected by one's view or non-view of revelation. We have cast off divine revelation. We don't believe in it anymore. And what do we know? There's no restraint, and people are going nuts and losing their minds. Now, another principle, too, is this idea of authority. All right? One of the reasons that the Ten Commandments exist, honor your father and mother, that is a principle of authority that applies to all of these realms. Right? It applies to authority in the church. It applies to authority within history with the councils. Do not remove the landmarks that your father set. It applies to authority within the civil sphere. The commandments to obey father and mother are just the basic principles of authority. Now, the whole modern world has cast off the idea that there's such a thing as authority, right? Oh, now suddenly we believe in science, reason. We don't accept things on the basis of authority. Oh, but oops, actually, it turns out that the things that come to us from so-called science and so-called reason, the new atheists and all those clowns, they're actually just propped up with a bunch of bad arguments and money and propaganda. So you're still getting it from authority. You thought you were getting away from authority, but it looks like Foucault was right. Your new authorities are social engineers. Lab coats. You traded out vestments for lab coats. And centuries and centuries of people bought into it. They thought, we're going to be free. We're going to get freedom. We're free from the tyranny of the church. And when leaders of the church or the state are corrupt and the revolution happens, it doesn't mean the revolution was good, but that becomes a chastisement, you see. Quite literally becomes the sin becomes the punishment, as Scripture says. Paul says in Romans 1. Now, there are plenty, constant statements in Proverbs about kings and nobility. Kings rule by wisdom. Kings rule by righteousness. A nation is exalted by righteousness, but sin is a disgrace to any people. Did you hear me? So that means the entire social order, the nations are judged by divine moral law. Divination is on the lips of the king. His mouth must not transgress in judgments. Honest weights and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are God's work. It is an abomination for kings to commit wickedness, but a throne is established by righteousness. That doesn't sound like a whole lot of Jeffersonian, Ben Franklin Satanism gobbledygook, does it? No, it doesn't. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. In other words, the moral law applies to the nations, you see. Got a bunch of theocratic texts kind of marked out here. But I also wanted to add too that God says, Proverbs 8, by me, by wisdom, kings reign and rulers decree justice. By me, princes rule and the nobility and all the judges of the earth. That's Jesus talking. Okay, that's not contrary to Matthew 5 and the Beatitudes. It's the same God who said both things. And in the New Testament, Peter, Paul, they teach the exact same thing. So, it's not any different in the Psalms. I mean, I could go on and on. How many zillions of texts does it take before people realize this shit, right? What does Jesus say in Psalm 2? Peoples plot a vain thing, and kings of the earth and rulers set themselves together against the Lord and against his Christ, saying, let us break aside his bonds. That's exactly true, isn't it? The kings of this world who want to rule against God, they say, let's take down Christ, his church, that's our enemy. They hate God, they hate Christ, but they're still accountable to him. They still rule by his providence. You see. It doesn't say Jesus came to get rid of kings. No. What does Isaiah say? Isaiah says, as if you listen to my New Testament talk, again, we saw how many times the predictions in the Old Testament are that entire kingdoms of the Gentiles will convert to worship the God of Israel. That's been happening for 2,000 years in the history of the church. Right? How many times does Isaiah say, kings and queens will come and submit to Jesus, the God of Israel? Over and over and over and over. And people can't even figure out what Isaiah is talking about in supposed Orthodox churches. A couple verses I wanted to add from the many, many books that the Protestants don't even have, that they cut out of their Bibles, which the Deuterocanon was actually in the original King James. A wise leader educates his people, and the rule of an intelligent man is well ordered. As goes the ruler of a people, so are his officials, and all the inhabitants of a city will reflect its ruler. An undisciplined king will ruin his people, but a city will be made habitable through the wisdom of its rulers. The authority of the earth is in the hand of God, and he raises up the right man at an appointed time. The success of man is in the hands of the Lord. He confers his honor upon the person of the scribe. Do not cherish anger against your neighbor for injury, and do nothing by acts of insolence. You see, that's the same thing Jesus says in Matthew 5, right? About not hating your enemy, not hating your brother. There's no difference between the teaching of the Old Testament and the New Testament. They are perfectly in harmony. Arrogance is hateful before God and man. Wrongdoing is offensive to both. Dominion is transferred from nation to nation because of the wrongdoing and insolence of and the wealth of its people. The fear of the Lord goes before obtaining authority. Roughness and arrogance is the losing thereof. The rich and the honored and the poor alike, their boasting is in the fear of the Lord. It is not right to dishonor an intelligent poor man, nor is it proper to honor a sinful man. The nobleman, the judge, and the ruler are to be honored, but none of them is greater than the man who fears the Lord. On and on and on. Okay, there's many, many, many examples, right, in wisdom and in the wisdom texts that speak of well-ordered social situations. But I wanted to just show you a few of those because these are, of course, the Protestants will have none of this. And so you cut, dozens and dozens of chapters of wisdom and insight and how to have a healthy social order out of your scriptures. And I also had here, you look at the imperial sacra, that is in the ecumenical councils, you'll have statements about letters to the emperor, about the emperor, so forth. Role of the emperor, the empress in the church from Nicaea 1 in 325 all the way up to Nicaea 2 in 787. Okay, all these ecumenical councils. And I'm just giving an example from Nicaea too. There's plenty of these, but we read in the, which document is this? This is the letter of the synod to the emperor and the empress. And they talk about, they rule at the pleasure of God, the good pleasure of God, to the renowned metropolis of Nicaea, the second council assembled in the city. It goes on to talk about God as the head of the church, blah, 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 the heretics. And then it says, heretics make war on the church. We have sent our brethren and fellow priests, our God-beloved bishops, together with the hegumen and the clergy, that they may give a full report of our proceedings to your godly hearing ears, in proof of our confirmation and of what we have decreed, and also for the assurance of your most religious majesty. We have submitted proofs from the church fathers, and many proofs together illustrating the doctrines. And now may the Savior of us all who reigns with you, the Savior of us all who reigns with you, and who was pleased to vouchsafe peace to the churches through you, the emperor, preserve your kingdom for many, many years, and your council and your princes and your faithful army, and the whole estate of the empire. And may God give you victory over all your enemies. This is why the church has never had a problem praying imprecatory prayers. As I live, says the Lord, they that glorify me, I will glorify. He it is, God, who has glorified your strength, Emperor. And may he smite all your enemies and make your people rejoice. Could you imagine the boomer docs and the Ameridocs speaking this way? Could you imagine? I mean, I was at a liturgy recently and they were talking about righteous kings like David. And then they're turning around and talking about American principles in government. Do thou, O city, the new Zion, rejoice and be glad, for thou art the wonder of the whole world. For although David has not reigned in thee, nevertheless your pious princes here preside over thy affairs, as David would have done. God is in your midst. Theocracy at Nicaea too. Take that. Could you imagine? Could you imagine? Now, you say, so what? Who cares what was said in 787? We believe in freedom and liberty. My freedom. Have they ever read Reflections of a Russian Statesman by Konstantin Petrovich Pobyadnashev? No, they haven't, and they never will read it. Because here you will see, what is this image? Why, it's the double-headed eagle, isn't it? Underneath a single crown. Church and state in symphonia. Man and God in synergy. Two natures of Christ in synergy. Synergy. Cooperation. Many nations within one imperium. Synergy. Under God. But the modernists, the Masons, the Americanists, they all have the same doctrine. They don't believe this. They say this is crazy, and then they turn around and promote U.S. imperialist interests in the Ukraine. They're a bunch of hypocrites. But what I'm pointing out, the reason I'm pointing out this book is because here is a normal Russian statesman in 1898 reflecting the exact same doctrine from Nicaea II in 787. From 787 all the way up to 1898, the exact same idea. Nobody was confused. Nobody had to reinvent the wheel to go back and figure out, what does the New Testament say about the role of the state? Let's see, Romans 13. How does an evangelical... No, we already had all this stuff worked out 1,000 years, 800 years, 1,200 years before any of these goofuses who have never read any of this stuff came to the table. Do you ever hear Roman Catholics talking about the principles of the role of the imperium from the councils? No, you don't. They don't ever talk about that. Well, what about the pious tradition of the saints? Certainly they don't believe in this nonsense. They were against the state. No, you're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. What does Father Seraphim Rose say? Well, in his book on nihilism, he says, in the Christian order, politics too was founded upon absolute truth. Exactly. If there's absolute truth, then we don't have relativism in politics. We've already seen in the preceding chapter that the principal providential form of government that took in union with Christian truth was the Orthodox Christian Empire, wherein sovereignty was vested in a monarch and authority proceeded from him downwards through a hierarchical social structure. We shall see in the next chapter, on the other hand, that how a politics that rejects this Christian truth must acknowledge the people. It's inverted. Where have we seen inversion before? Well, everywhere, haven't we? It's all inversion. And what do the Ameridocs and the Boomerdocs, what do they want to do? They want to tell us that the principles of democracy and revolutionary Freemasonry and the sovereignty of the people, that's all perfectly consonant with Christian truth. That's all. Jesus came as the liberator to free us from the death penalty, some of these clowns say. No wonder people don't find this convincing. They're talk nonsense. They don't even know their own history. Who would be convinced by this? Let's see. I was going to pull up an image here. So that was Father Rose. Where's my image? I'm going to pull up an image here. Anyway, I just went blank. It was something to do from church. Something from church history was. Oh, I know what it was. Yeah. It's almost like they hate church history, isn't it? Yeah, it is, isn't it? Now, for millennia, okay, whether it's the Orthodox West, or the Orthodox East, or the later non-Orthodox West, do we have any idea how rulers come to be? Like we have no, like this has never been discussed. Nobody knows. Maybe let's just make it up as we go. Or maybe there were actually thousands and centuries, thousands of years of coronation services. Okay. The ignorance of people about church history is astounding. But as Vox Day says correctly, we live in a post-literate society. So foolish, so arrogant, so ignorant as to tell me and act like there weren't coronation ceremonies performed by the church in all of these centuries for rulers. Now, sometimes the ruler is selected from the people. Sometimes it's hereditary, right? There's different situations. That's fine. But come on. This is basic history to know that the church ordained the monarchs. And they did that because power comes from up down. It doesn't come from the bottom up. It doesn't mean that people have no position, no rule, no authority, no power. No, the people can select who they want in some cases. If the people want a hereditary monarchy, they can select that. If they want it to be more constitutional, they can select that. But the church has performed coronation ceremonies for centuries. This is why there are saints who are kings. I mean, hello. Who am I talking to? Who are these people? How do they not even, some of them fancy themselves church history buffs. And then they turn around and act like, well, there's no doctrine of the magistrate. Orthodoxy doesn't have a social theory. Well, who would believe this dumb religion then if it doesn't have a social theory? Oh, it has no doctrine of the magistrate. We don't care about that. Yes, it does. What? Just the idiocy. It's almost like they're mind controlled. Maybe they are. John Holloway, $5. I'm sorry, Shauna Sawyer, $10. Credit to Brehon laws of ancient Ireland, codified by St. Patrick. Oh, interesting. I wasn't aware of that. In accordance with what you said about canon law is the basis for civilization. There you go. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, when you don't want divine revelation, what did we just read in Proverbs? When the people cast off that restraint, they turn into cannibalistic goblins. And they're turning into cannibalistic goblins now. And you say, power corrupts. We don't want anything to do with the civil sphere. And then all of the demons rush in to crush you. And they will crush you. John Holloway, $5. Is there any historical evidence for Hoppe suggesting that monarchies tend to be more progressive and free than democracies and republics? Yeah. Look at tax laws under monarchies versus tax laws now. I think that's one of his chief arguments, isn't it? Rate of taxation. The Lone Slav, $10. I'm in the process of joining my local Orthodox church, but I'm a bit hesitant because there is a black priest. Am I just being racist? Yeah, I mean, there's not really any reason why a black priest would necessarily be problematic. I mean, we've had saints, obviously many black saints in the history of the church. If you mean that you detect like social justice, Black Lives Matter type ideas or something, that might be a cause for concern. But really, rather than worrying about his skin color, I would be more concerned with what he talks about and teaches. You know what I mean? Does he talk about higher criticism in the Bible and errors in the Bible? Does he talk about the Old Testament's an evil God? Does he talk about how good Freemasons are? Does he talk about, I don't know, 100 other, easy indicators of being paused, I guess you could say. So I would say that's more important than whether he's a black dude. Because there's beige black dudes, you know what I mean? There's a lot of beige black dudes, which is a good thing. And I met one Orthodox black dude who was pretty cool for a long time, and then he started getting into Marxism, and we had an argument one time on Facebook. I don't know if we're still friends or not. I haven't really checked in on him, but he used to write a lot on patristics, and then he got all into Marxism. So, and I tried to dialogue with him because, if you want to just criticize capitalism, that's cool, but Marxism is not an answer. It's a fake dialectic. So I was trying to explain the dialectic, and I don't think we really got anywhere. So I don't know what's happened to that dude. I haven't really kept up with him, but the problem is that it's some of the people who get into the Ameridox, the liberal strands of this stuff, they get introduced into Marxism, and then they just go into the foundation-funded niches, the little cul-de-sacs of the Fordham circles and all that, leftist CIA foundation stuff. And you start trying to talk to them about the CIA and the foundations, and they don't know what you're talking about. They think you're crazy, even though it's all public. Like, it would take them 5 minutes to figure out, who funds these foundations. It's like, at this point, if people can't and aren't willing to figure that basic level of stuff out, there's no point in talking to them. Just don't even talk to them, because they're not going to wake up until they want to. So there's no point. Just give up. You pray for them, but the Lone Slav, $5. Thanks, Jay. Yeah, I really should see what he believes. Yeah, I think that's a better approach. I guess it depends on where you are too. I've never been to Africa. There was just a king of Uganda who was baptized at Mount Athos. I guess it just depends on where you are. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure there's a lot of based African Orthodox. There are quite a few African Orthodox. In fact, entire villages, kingdoms are converting to Orthodoxy in Africa now. So, I don't know where you are. Are you there? Are you in America? America is such a mixed bag. You can have a really good Orthodox church or a nightmare church. And then you can have some mediocre ones. So it's kind of all over the place. That's why we can't really have like a one size fits all answer when people ask me these questions. Because you could have a good Greek church, and then you could have a terrible one. You could have a awesome, But actually, if that seems a little strange, think about Revelation. Think about Revelation 2 and 3 when Jesus writes to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. That's exactly the way he talks, right? Your church, this church here, Laodicea, you have this problem. You're doing this good, but you got this problem. Get rid of this problem. You over here, this is really bad. You guys are really bad. If you don't fix this problem, I'm going to yank your lampstand. You're going to be gone. And guess what? Some of those churches, they're gone. Some of the churches of Asia Minor, they don't exist anymore. They got their lampstand yanked. They're gone. And the same thing's going to happen to these Ameridox. They have a choice to make, and Jesus will yank their lampstand. They won't be here anymore. Orthodox Pilgrim, $9.99. Do you agree racism and arguments for racial superiority are incompatible with Christianity and specifically Orthodoxy? This is too difficult of a question to enter into on this stream. Superiority is ambiguous. Okay, what do we mean by superiority? Because if we mean humility before God and salvation, none of the races have anything on the other one. They're all equal before needing God, needing salvation. If we mean in terms of different people groups building different types of societies, yes. Are different people groups and genetic classification groups gifted in different ways? Obviously. So the modern superiority talk is almost always couched in the Darwinian terms. So I always argue against that and reject that because it's almost always tied to biological determinism, the presuppositions of the Royal Society, of the Victorian Darwinists at the time of Darwin. We just covered this in the talk. That's all bogus. It doesn't mean everything that they discovered is bogus. It just means that the presuppositions are bogus. If you watch the new the new documentary on Byzantium, I thought they made an interesting point about how nationalism can be used as a tool to divide people. And it was part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason that Byzantium fell apart. So you had monetary corruption, you had greed for profits, usury problems, you had ethnic pride and division that broke down the imperium. And again, this is the most stable economic empire and situation in human history. So what breaks it down? Ethnic superiority, division, and conflict. So I think that the Byzantine ideal wasn't to destroy all the nation states. Okay, so again, this is not a situation where we try to set up some engineered Babel of the European Union. Okay. The ideal was to have symphonia and harmony amongst the nation states within the imperium. That was the goal. Didn't always happen. It's not always going to happen within history. We live in a fallen world, and the fact that we live in a fallen world is one of the reasons for the existence of the state. It's a gift given from God so that we don't revert to a brutal state of nature. Now, unfortunately, yes, the state is corrupt many times. Most of the time in history, it falls into corruption. Most human institutions fall into corruption. And that's why it's unrealistic. It's LARPing to act like we're going to resurrect the Byzantine Empire. No, it's come and gone, dude. You can't recreate forms that have come and gone within history. Roman Empire is not coming back. Byzantine Empire is not coming back. Ottoman Empire is not coming back. You can stand on the shoulders of giants and borrow and build with some aspects of the past. But history, the movement of cultures, civilizations, it's always going forward. It's never freezing. It's never stopped. There's no dialectic either between time and eternity. This is another dialectic that heretics and Platonists and people erect. And if you read Stan Eloy's doctrine, he talks about a lot about time in Volume 1 of Dogmatics. It's pretty deep, really, really deep stuff about time and eternity and how they're not in dialectical tension. But the reason it relates to civilizations and imperiums is that we can appreciate kind of what Spengler says about civilizations having a birth, flourishing, and a death period, a genesis, and a kind of necrosis, necritis period. Eventually, they come and go. And this is consonant with the way Daniel describes the empires too, right? I see a similarity between Spengler and Daniel. But Spengler is wrong to say that there's nothing contiguous across these empires. There's no truths that move across the empires. So he becomes a cultural relativist. That's the chief problem with Spengler. And Daniel is a superior historian to Spengler because he was a prophet, first of all, and he predicted the future. Spengler did have some prophetic insight, right? He knew he saw why and how the West would decline, and he did have some almost prophetic at times insights, but certainly nothing like the prophet Daniel. So, point being, the racial and ethnic conflicts are intended to be harmonized in the overarching spectrum of the imperium, and then you have the one and the many relationship intended, not always, but intended to be in balance within the imperium. And that's what was achieved for a long time to a great, probably to the highest degree humanly possible, right? And of course, eventually Byzantium fell, and Gennadius Scholarios predicted how and why Byzantium would fall. And he even kind of got the date right. And he knew how it was going to fall on the basis of the treachery of the Latin West and what the Crusaders were pushing and why they were going to eventually, after the union with Rome, Florence, so forth, what was going to lead to the demise of Byzantium, and he was right. So the gift of prophecy continues on in the church, doesn't it? But and those are not the same as public revelation for you Protestants out there. Clairvoyance in the church is not the same thing as divine revelation. The canon is closed, more or less. Public revelation is ceased, I should say. I also wanted to add to, in Zechariah, and we're going to be doing a Zechariah video. The reason I've been slow on that is because it's an extremely deep book. It's kind of like the Apocalypse of the Old Testament, just like Ezekiel. So it's not really a book that you can easily do, a video on like Hosea or Amos. But I want to point out that there's a very important insight in the book of Zechariah, which even the notes in the Orthodox Study Bible get right. If you look at Zechariah 3 and 4, we read in 4, the two olive trees that Zechariah sees, they're church and state, right, before God. Zechariah asks twice more about the olive trees, and he's finally told, these are the two sons of richness that stand beside the Lord of all the earth. They represent the two powers or functions held by two men at this time, Zerubbabel, the political leadership, and Joshua, the high priest, the sacerdotal leadership. So Zechariah sees these two lampstands, okay? Church and state. And that's what all of chapter 4 of Zechariah is about. Now, there's a lot of predictions of Christ all through here, obviously. It's completely obviously. It even predicts when the Messiah comes, will be a Gentile church and state. And even the menorah at this time represents the relationship of church and state in chapters 3 and 4. But of course, Yeshua, the high priest, Yeshua, the high priest, that's a type of Jesus, the Yeshua, the high priest, okay? That is fulfilled when Christ comes. But guess what? The imagery of the lampstands and these spiritual principles standing before God, that's not done away. Church and state in Symphonia continues on. That relationship is not erased when Jesus comes, not done away. Jesus isn't and he's not an anarcho-libertarian. He's not an anarcho-pacifist. That's like super low IQ, trying to read the New Testament there. So anyway, I got way off, but if you look at this drama that's going on with the Ukraine, you can see how nationalism can be a tool for the globalists. So nationalism is a good thing, and nationalism is positive, but it can also be turned as a tool. So, we hear a lot of the alt media saying we're pro-nationalist, not globalist. Typically, we can agree with that, but we have to keep a couple things in mind. First is to keep in mind that modern nation states are not ancient, traditional nation states. They share some similarities, but modern nation states typically arise out of the revolutionary period. So when the French Revolution, American Revolution, when they began, they were nationalistic revolutionary forces. They were reactions to previous attempts at Holy Roman Empire and that kind of stuff. So they're revolutionary in their approach. They're not exactly the same as the nations, in Matthew 28 when Jesus says, "Go forth, convert the nations." There's some similarities, right? Armenia is still presumably Armenia from ancient times, right? So that's a nation state that is very synonymous with that. But modern France, is that exactly the same as the medieval Frankish? Not exactly, right? So it's very vague when we talk about modern nations. And the Ukraine is a perfect example of this because that's a modern created nation state. It's just made up out of Western powers as a bulwark against Russia. It's an attempt to divide power from Russia and the Russian Empire. And it's been that ever since it came to be. And that's why the racial nationalism is pushed, and the West has absolutely no qualms about pushing complete racial neo-Nazi right sector type stuff in the Ukraine because it serves the Pentagon there. In America, however, that's all no. you got to accept the total social justice globalism in America. So there's different propaganda for these different places, you see. So the modern structures of nation states are not analogous to ancient and medieval nation states. They bear some similarities. Just having nationalism is not enough. The foe is global. Just having a nation state is not enough. Now, the nationalist movements that we're seeing, I'm iffy on that. I mean, I think the Orban stuff, maybe, okay. Poland, maybe. Bolsonaro, he's a Mason. I mean, come on. I'm not really... And again, the Freemasons all supported the nationalist revolutions. But that doesn't mean that having a nation or people or whatever, that's wrong. I'm just saying it's very complex and it's very tricky in modern geopolitics. And we're kind of hamstrung. We're in this dilemma where, on the one hand, we want to have the appreciation of our nation and our civilization. But at the same time, if we all fall into nationalism, that's not enough to defeat an international globalist perspective. And the basis for the nationalism in Greece and the nationalism in Ukraine, the danger is that you can have ethnophilotism that is destructive. Okay, so I've gone back and forth on this issue because on the one hand, ethnophilotism seems like everybody who opposes that is just a globalist. However, if you look at the Ukraine, they're basing their new church and they're on ethnophilotism. And if you deal with Greeks, not all of them, and I'm not saying every Greek in Greece is bad. I'm just saying, like, the American Greeks, they don't do evangelism. They don't, because they don't want to have other. That's retarded. So that's an example of going in the wrong direction. The church is Catholic. It's universal. And you have to let people come to your church and accept them, and you have to do evangelism. If you don't do that, you're forsaking the gospel, and your lampstand is going to be yanked away. So that's, again, what does Jesus say to the seven churches in chapters 2 and 3? And you're going to see the Greeks in America, their lampstand is going to be yanked away. They're probably all going to unite with Rome. I mean, they're doing the most ridiculous things imaginable. So I'm talking about the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, obviously. But if you read their manuals, they say, we pride ourselves in being Greek, and that's why we don't make converts. And we've agreed with the other ecumenists not to make converts so that we can remain precious, proud Greeks. No. And that goes for any of the groups. It doesn't matter. You can have... What does John the Baptist say to the prideful Jews about, we are sons of Abraham? He says, God's able to raise up sons from these stones, and he doesn't need you. And the same thing applies to the pride of the Greeks and the pride of Russians or anybody. And if they all get prideful, I mean, it's right there in Paul's... What does Paul say to the Romans? He says, don't get arrogant. God will yank you out. If we just paid attention to the rebukes that Jesus gives to the seven churches, we could probably fix most of the problems in the church. And notice that he says they have different problems. Now, he doesn't say because they have a problem that they're not churches. They can eventually become not churches if they get so corrupt and degraded. But these rebukes are so timely and timeless and applicable to... Now, Ephesus, okay, what's the problem with the church of Ephesus? So imagine Jesus looking at the churches, and what would he say? What would he say about the OCA? What would he say about Rocor? What would he say about the Roman church? I don't think the Roman church is cut out, but we could apply these things still loosely. If we mean specifically to Orthodoxy, what would he say? Well, these things, says he who has the seven golden lampstands and the seven stars, He says, I know your works and your labor. So Jesus pays attention to works that we do. I know your patience. I know that you cannot bear those who are evil. That's all good. You're doing good things there. I know that you have tested those that are claiming to be apostles, and they're not. And you have found them to be liars. You have persevered, and you have patience. And you've labored for my name's sake, and you haven't become weary. However, I have these things against you. You left your first love. So remember from where you've fallen, and repent and do your first works. Or else I will come to you quickly, and I will remove your lampstand, unless you repent. But you have this also, that's a positive. You hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which is some heretic. So notice what Jesus sees as positives and negatives here. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the 7 churches. So they did a lot of good things here. There's some good here. However, church at Ephesus had some problems, and they were losing their love and were becoming cold and calculated and only concerned with doctrines, I guess. Smyrna, the persecuted church. I know that you know the blasphemy of those who claim to be Jews and they're not. They're a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear those who are about to suffer, for the devil is about to throw some of you into prison. If you persevere, then I will give you the crown of life. I know your works. I know your tribulations, he says. And he says, don't be fear. Don't fear. Don't fear. So he doesn't say anything. He has no complaints against the Smyrnians. What about the church at Pergamos? They're compromised with the world. These things I say, who has the sharp two-edged sword. I know your works and where you dwell. You are where Satan's throne is, which is fascinating. So Satan apparently does have locations on earth, right? Where he has a throne. So you are there where Satan's throne is, and you have held fast to my name. You've not denied me, even in the days in which Antipas, my martyr, was killed among you, where Satan actually dwells. That's crazy. But I have some things against you. You hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block for the children of Israel and to eat things sacrificed to idol and to be sexually immoral. So you have, and you tolerate those who have the doctrines of the Nicolaitans, which I hate. So whatever this, and I don't think anybody for certain knows what the doctrine of the Nicolaitans was. There's a lot of speculations. Some kind of weird, creeper sect of some kind. And Jesus is saying, you're tolerating these heretics, these weirdos. And he says, repent, or you're gone. Thyatira, they're corrupt. He says, I know your works. Some of you are good. Some of you are loving and faithful. Nevertheless, you allow that woman, Jezebel, not literally Jezebel, but the spirit of Jezebel, by this dumb woman who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit immorality and to eat things sacrificed to idols. I gave you time to repent, and she did not repent. So it's interesting that he gives a time period where he allows them to see what will happen. So she didn't, and therefore he cast her into a sickbed, and those who commit adultery with her will go into tribulation unless they repent. So he sends curses of sickness. Hello. Do you remember Deuteronomy, the blessings and the curses? They're exactly applied here, aren't they? Perfect continuity. I am he who searches the minds and the hearts, and I will give to each one of you according to your works. Now to you and the rest of those in Thyatira, as many as have this doctrine, those of you who have not known the depths of Satan, I will not put on you these burdens, but hold fast till I come. Now the coming here, of course, as we know in book 1 or chapter 1, is soon to happen in the first century. This is the coming, the destruction of Jerusalem. It's also the coming, as he says, in judgment on these churches. It's not talking about the coming of the end of the world, because that did not come quickly. We're 2,000 years past when this was written, so obviously it wasn't quickly in that sense. The later chapters of the book are talking about the second coming, yes. I'm just doing this because it's illustrative to see Jesus' perspective of churches. And this applies to our day now. This is how he would, when he looks at the churches, this is what he would say. And notice he doesn't have a problem applying curses, chastisements to churches. And he doesn't have a problem saying, you're apostate and you tolerate heretics, and if you keep doing it, I'll yank your lampstand. And nobody's concerned. Nobody cares about the pride of the Greeks or the pride of the Romanians, the pride of the Serbians, the pride of Rome. Nobody cares about that. That doesn't get you anywhere. Does that mean that being a Greek or a Roman or Serbian is... No, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that he consistently warns these people about trusting in false things. What does Paul say to the Romans in Romans 11? He says, if you get arrogant against the Jews, God will cut you out and he will accept the Jews. They will convert. And I wonder if that's not what's going to happen. I wonder if the entire Gentile church, for the most part, because the church is majority Gentile, if they're not going to apostatize, and then God will convert the Jews and graft them back in, as he says in Romans 11, and then they will make the Gentiles look like idiots, and then they'll have to reconvert the entire world. That's what Romans 11 seems to say. And when we look at the Gentile church today, is it faithful? No. I almost think something crazy, I don't know how soon, I think something crazy like that might happen. The church at Sardis, they're dead. They're dead church. Church of Philadelphia, they're faithful. It doesn't say anything about them. Who's the worst? Laodicea, the lukewarm. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there. It's just kind of a way of when we look at these different churches and with the different things within Orthodoxy, and how does God view it? Well, he views it like that. Shauna Sawyer, $10. I love these talks. Charles Columbe, the Trad Cat, has a lot to say about Christianity and monarchy. Yeah, I mean, we've been familiar with each other for probably 10 years via Facebook. I don't think we've ever directly interacted. We might have had some comment interactions, but we've never like interacted. I think he's a committed Augustinian, which is interesting. I've had that same view at one time in my younger days. And that's not an insult. I know he's my elder, but I would be open to a discussion with him. But yeah, he really likes Neoplatonism, and he likes Augustine, and I know he says he likes Thomas too, but I mean, he probably wouldn't want to talk because it would end up in a theology debate. I don't know, but I guess I'm always open to having a conversation. Benjamin Collins, £5. Thank you. You make understanding this stuff so much easier. Well, you're welcome. Thank you. Appreciate it. There was one more thing we were going to get to. What was it? We're getting pretty long in the tooth, as they say. 2 hours, 25 minutes. Was there anything else I wanted to, let's see. Now, St. Philaret, he would bless the troops before battle. He would pray God give them victory. Prayer books have imprecatory prayers in them that we have victory against the enemies. The nation states, the imperium. We just read that in the 7th Council. The Apocalypse presents Christ as the King of Kings, not as the King of Presidents, the King of Democrats, the King of Anarcho-Communists, the King of whatever. Obviously, that's not true. And again, there's a lot more. There's many more New Testament texts that speak of the role of the magistrate. Also, I want to stress too, this is another fallacy. It's completely not true. A lot of people say, "Oh, well, the early church believed they were pacifists and they didn't believe in the death penalty." And then when Constantine, took over the church and whatever, all this nonsense. But people in these different traditions make this dumb argument. You'll see Orthodox make it. You'll see Roman Catholics make it. Protestants make it. They'll make this stupid argument, which is like a completely retarded Seventh-day Adventist type of Baptist argument. And it's not true. You can read the Apostolic Fathers, the Post-Apostolic Fathers. They talk about the legitimacy of the death penalty because Paul did. They didn't teach pacifism. Now, it is true that some groups, and there were controversies in the first few centuries of the church where some people did think pacifism was the true teaching. But what do we see in Nicaea? Right? Nicaea dealt with this controversy, and they said, no, you don't have to stop being a soldier to be a Christian. Jesus didn't tell the Roman centurion and the Roman soldiers to get out of the army or you're dead. No, he told them, what did he say? He said, don't rip people off, don't terrorize people, be just. Right? John the Baptist told the Roman soldiers the same thing. Didn't say he had to get out of the military. Get out of here. That nonsense. Where do these people get? I mean, where do they get these ideas? Like Jesus came to be against the civil state. I mean, just ignorance, just total ignorance, right? Dylan Potts, $5. Thank you, Dylan. Much appreciated. So I wanted to stress. Now I wrote an article about this too. You can Athanasius says war can be just. He has a letter where he talks about virtue. You can even be virtuous in war. Ambrose talks about it. And the way that all these fathers in this period, why do you think nobody has told you about the way the church fathers speak of the emperors? Why do you never learn about Byzantium? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because they want you to believe the garbage of people like Rod Dreher that you're not supposed to have anything to do with the civil sphere. That's why. Because that makes you neutered and weak. And that means that the goblins can rule you. That's why. I think that's and a lot more could be said about the civil magistrate, but we have to start somewhere, okay? So I'm not saying this was like the definitive thing on the civil magistrate. There's a lot more that could be said. I'm going to work through McGuckin's book, Ascent of Christian Law. He's written some really good Christology books. I've only read a few chapters of this one, so I can't speak yet to whether I can recommend this book. But maybe we'll do an analysis of it or something if it turns out to be pretty good. But he did do the Ascent of Christian Law, which we might work through. But I'm not going to yet recommend it yet because we don't know where this is going to go. You know, he might try to turn this into some tractate about how Christianity has nothing to do with the civil sphere and Byzantium was a giant failure. I mean, we don't know where it's going to go. So I'm not going to recommend it yet, but we might do that book. But I think the next thing that we're going to do in our talks is we will finally do, I've been talking about doing this for a year. We're going to do Father Rose's Nihilism, the root of the revolution, the modern age. We're going to do a good critique of nihilism from this book. So that'll probably be next in this series. I will be on in a little bit with KJ. I'm excited for that. Giant channel. Giant. KJ is almost up to 500,000 subs now. Wow. Great guy. We are friends with KJ. We're not gonna. KJ is an evangelical, but we're friends with KJ. Cool guy, very laid back. Scariest movie ever channel. And KJ's videos, man, they have been getting better and better and better. He's putting out really good stuff. And proud of KJ, waking a lot of people up. So we're going to be talking about Esoteric Hollywood 2 and anything. Going to be open floor. So about 8 o'clock Eastern, hop on over to Scariest Movie Ever channel and join me and KJ for a big chat. And I think too, also in terms of Vox sent me a copy of Jordanetics, so I'm going to have to read Jordanetics, and then I think Vox and I might do a stream maybe, but I'm going to have to read the book first, obviously. by the way, I'm going to put in the chat too, our friend Dean, who was my godfather in chrismation. Dean wrote a good essay a couple of years ago for Soul of the East on biblical position of monarchy. So I'll put that there in the chat. I'll stick it also in the description there. If people want to kind of check in on a written version of a lot of the stuff I've talked about. And Dean, of course, wrote that, based on his insights. He was a big, long-time subscriber to Jay's analysis, so a lot of those arguments he's heard from me, not just me. I mean, he wrote his article, obviously, from his own wisdom as well. I'm not taking credit. I'm just saying that we had a lot of the same ideas about kingship, and he deals with the Samuel text very well. So Dean's article is really good there, Dean Arnold, and I recommend that for people who want to read on this topic. And that's it, I think. I don't see any more super chats. Thank you guys very much. Great talk. Hopefully this gives us a coherent perspective. I mean, really what it comes down to is there a revealed doctrine of the magistrate? Okay, it's not a question of what do I want the magistrate to be? What do we want to maximize so-called freedom? It's not a question of what Jefferson and Franklin thought was the best thing in history. It's not a question of any of that. It's a question of what's the revealed doctrine? What has the church determined in history if we accept the authority of the church? And then it's also a question of what have the revolutions of the last 300 years done? Well, the Masonic revolutions of the last 300 years have basically rebelled against all thrones and altars. So overthrow all throne and altar everywhere in the world and set up the technocracy. That's been the entire plan, and they did it. And it's in everybody's faces, clear as day. And absolutely nobody hardly in the world wants to believe the biblical doctrine and the historic church doctrine. Anyway. Please contact Tom How Knows. I don't know who that is. Looking through the chat here. Yeah, KJ, scariest movie ever in about an hour and a half. All right. Cool beans. Thank you guys. God bless. Have a good night. And be sure and tune in to Scariest Movie Ever, 8 o'clock. I expect you guys to all be there. And yeah, I did see Owen Benjamin. Owen gave us a shout out. That's good. He says something like, I think he has a list of people he wants to get to. So hopefully we'll be on his list eventually, and we can have a good chat about whatever he wants to talk about. Sounds fun. I look forward to that. Hopefully it comes to be if he wants to do it. And anyway, so we're done now. Subscribe to Jay's Analysis. Get copies of Esoteric Hollywood 2. Signed copies now available at the site, in the shop. Have a good night.